Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jocelyn Paulley. I'm a partner in the IT and data team here at Gowling WLG, and I'm joined today by Matt Harris, a senior associate in my team. Today's webinar is going to look at how we can help to plan and cater for unexpected events that might occur during the course of any kind of IT project. We've been looking at this obviously in the light of COVID-19 and lockdown and the effect that's had on the whole world in the last few months, but these themes are relevant for planning for any kind of unexpected event or disaster that might occur during the life of the contract. So we're going to look at how you can build mechanisms into your contract to give you flexibility, resilience, and levers that you can pull to try to mitigate the effects where people or goods or both are unavailable or delayed due to whatever's been happening. The themes we're going to look at are: how do you start off? How can you plan an objective set and incentivize your supplier to perform in both the good times and the bad? Then we'll consider some areas where you can create single points of failure within a contract, which is obviously something you want to avoid if you're trying to create resilience. We always have our force majeure clauses, but we're going to look at some of the limitations of those clauses, seeing how they have been stress tested during the recent pandemic. Then, how do you create a rapid response? So when something does go wrong, you've got all the things you need at your fingertips, ready to go to put yourself in the best possible position to see the disaster through and recover. And finally, if the worst really does happen and you have to part ways with your supplier, what does an orderly exit look like and how can you plan for it?
Great, so I'm going to kick off by looking at how we can plan for projects and how we can drive the best performance from suppliers. Our first piece of advice, I think, is to plan for events that you can foresee at the outset of the project. Careful planning goes into lots of projects, and it seems a shame that that's wasted by not including it within the contract, because it can be a benefit for both the customer and the supplier. The benefit of including detailed plans is that should an unexpected event occur, both the customer and the supplier can take stock, pause, and use the original plan to create solutions that enable both parties to move forward. Let me give you an example. If you have a detailed project plan against which you have mapped milestones and costs, should an extraordinary event intervene, it will be easy for the parties, or certainly easier for them to look at the obligations that have been performed, those that are outstanding, and then to see what sums are due and owing at the point of the extraordinary event. The theory here is that it should help to reduce the risk of dispute when the pressure is really on. But we can't always foresee which events will occur. When contracts are drafted, we tend to assume that the world in which we operate now will be broadly the same for the duration of the agreement. I think it's fair to say that 2020 has somewhat shattered this assumption for most of us. It's impossible to predict the future or to create a contract that will cover every scenario that could possibly arise. But you can draft contracts that provide flexibility or fallback positions. Well, what might this look like? Well, you could have mechanisms by which you could decrease the scope of your project or reduce committed volumes. Should an extraordinary event occur, there's likely to be an economic impact, and you're going to need to pivot accordingly. Reducing scope and volumes can be a way for a customer to protect their economic position. The best time to have these discussions is at the outset, when the contract is being drafted and negotiated. Negotiating the mix of an extraordinary event is extremely challenging and pressurized, and will lead to uncertain outcomes, no doubt. There's a tendency to think that suppliers will not want to engage in discussions around reducing volumes or scope during the negotiation process. But it's likely that pragmatic suppliers will take stock of the events of this year and could see the value in retaining revenue in the midst of extraordinary circumstances rather than walking away with nothing. So how do you get the best from your supplier through the contract? Well, traditionally, many organisations have used contractual terms to deter suppliers from underperformance or failure to perform. And it's true that deterrents are a good way to focus the mind of a supplier. We'd certainly recommend that you consider the use of deterrents such as liquidated damages, termination rights, or suspension rights. But our view is that to drive supplier performance, there needs to be a balance between deterrent and incentive. In our experience, incentivising suppliers can yield very positive results. Whether or not a particular incentive mechanism will be appropriate will depend on the nature of the contract and the supplier in question. But examples could be the use of gain share or key performance indicators linked to collaboration. But all good plans don't always work out, and no matter how much a supplier wants to perform, events beyond their control can prevent them from doing so. Therefore, it's important to structure your relationship and contract in a way that's going to avoid single points of failure. Joss is going to take you through some of the ways to deal with this issue.
So this is all about avoiding single points of failure within a contract. So we looked at our contracts and tried to think about where are those pinch points and how could you mitigate the effect of them occurring so that you have the coming together of a single point, and if that person or place or supply is not available, it's going to have a negative impact on the performance overall. So first of all, key personnel. Very common to see in all kinds of IT and services performance contracts, individuals listed out because of particular skill sets that they have. And indeed, that could have been your very reason for appointing a particular supplier in the first place, to get access to that skill set. We're not suggesting that you build huge teams around these key personnel, because that sounds like it would have a cost impact for a customer, but thinking about ways that if that individual was no longer available for some reason, they can have shared their knowledge within a team, or as a customer, you know what your plan B is as a backup to find someone else who has a similar skill set. There are some elements you could put in the contract, such as knowledge handover and know-how sharing being provided free of charge rather than at the customer's expense, but it might be a case of having an alternative arrangement rather than looking to the particular supplier you've engaged. Taking a step back from key personnel and looking at suppliers themselves, I've been talking to clients about amending their risk registers to look at a supplier and the monopoly position they might have in a market, just as you might look at their financial DD, check that they're not going to become insolvent during the life of your contract. Understanding whether a particular supplier has a unique position because of a set of skills or goods it produces or elements that it has access to, thinking about the elements in batteries. If that one supplier then was affected by some kind of event outside of its control or a disaster, what is your plan B for procuring that supply from an alternative source? You also need to look at the entire contracting chain, so not just the supplier that you have your contract and relationship with, but thinking particularly in an IT context about the whole stack of contracts and technologies that might make up a service, from the infrastructure to the hosting to the platform to the application, and identifying within that chain any of these single points of failure will put you in a much better position when something unexpected happens to immediately understand your chain and be able to preempt how it might be affected. Think also as well about the geographical aspect. In the recent context, we've seen the entire globe being affected, but in different times and to different degrees. So again, if you understand in advance where your supply chain is based, you can create your own risk strategies by deciding if you want more onshore or more offshore or more geographically dispersed suppliers to provide your goods and services. A slightly different point around supply contracts is where you have an exclusive relationship with a supplier. Clearly, these can be very powerful arrangements, and there can be huge benefits in terms of acquiring a unique skill set or something that singles out your supply to the market that makes you more attractive by having an exclusive relationship with a particular supplier. But these comes with greater risks as well. And it's very important to ensure you have built into the contract clauses and mechanisms and triggers so that where that supplier is not performing due to reasons outside of their control, it is very clear that a customer can go and procure that service from elsewhere. Otherwise, if those mechanisms aren't there and the customer did that, they would be in breach of the contract. And also thinking about location and geography. For some services, it's significant and they have to be provided from a particular location. That might be because you are maintaining and facilitating the running of servers in a particular place, like a data center. There's good reason that personnel are on site. Enabling a remote link to that data center to let people provide services when they're not physically at that site can be seen as a security risk because it's a link that doesn't need to be there. However, in the balance of providing the service at all versus providing it with a remote link that has some security risk associated with it, but that can be managed adequately, that would be a trade-off and a balance that you would need to look at in the context of something unexpected happening. It would give you greater flexibility, which is the aim here. These, though, are mainly operational issues or even pre-contract issues or issues for a risk register that as a customer procuring services or software, you should be thinking about. But what about the actual clauses that we normally have in a contract, such as force majeure, which are designed by their nature to deal with unexpected events? However, how helpful are they in reality?
We've seen a huge amount of commentary about force majeure clauses over the last few months. When the pandemic hit, companies were quickly dusting down their contracts to see what their rights were and checking to see whether the force majeure clause covered pandemics. There are multiple factors which determine whether a party can rely on a force majeure clause, such as did the force majeure clause cover the extraordinary event in question which prevented performance? Was the party prevented from performing? Did the party take steps to mitigate the impact of the force majeure event? Now, I think from that list, it's self-evident that the ability of a party to rely on force majeure is incredibly context-specific. Therefore, force majeure is not a magic bullet that will release a party from its obligations. And the courts will always look closely at context and events surrounding the force majeure event. Now, the effectiveness of this tool has to be closely looked at. And I've already said that there is a duty to mitigate. Companies will have taken steps which could help in future scenarios. So, for example, in the context of COVID, companies have invested huge amounts of money in remote working. It's arguable that these steps will affect the court's view in the future. For example, were a pandemic to hit in a couple of years' time and a company did not have remote working arrangements in place, it's arguable and conceivable that a court may suggest that they should have done so and have perhaps failed in their duty to mitigate. Now, that's conjecture, and context will dictate the outcome. It's worth bearing in mind. But how do you tackle delays caused by COVID? We're all aware of COVID. Companies have had time to react. And reliance on force majeure provisions at this point is going to be challenging. Companies entering into IT contracts now may wish to consider COVID-specific clauses, which set out what should happen in the event of delay to the project. So, for example, who has the responsibility to pay for delays? What should happen? How should the timeline be amended? And this is something which we've seen used in the construction industry already. Now, although I've talked in this slide about the limitations of force majeure, we're certainly not suggesting that you should stop including it within your contracts. In light of this year's events, you certainly need to make sure that the word pandemic is referenced. But also, it's worth checking to ensure that there's a clear reference to actions taken by governmental bodies. After all, in the case of the pandemic, organisations were typically not prevented from performing by COVID itself, but instead the restrictions put in place by the government to control the spread of the virus. And now, this is obviously been a challenging year and events have moved quickly. So it's important that companies remain agile. And Joss is going to talk through some steps that can be taken to create a rapid response to the contract and the contracting process.
So if you want to be able to respond quickly when the unexpected happens, you can only do that if you've prepared for it and planned well in advance. And that's what good disaster recovery clauses will look like in a contract. It will say there should be a plan, it should be tested regularly, it should be updated each year or when the services change, so it always reflects reality. Those clauses might be there in the contract, but unless customer and supplier have worked together to ensure that those tests have happened and both parties know what part they play in a disaster, it won't make dealing with it when disaster hits any easier. There's often some interesting interplay as well between a supplier's disaster recovery scenario and plans and the customer's own. And depending on the nature of the service or a cloud service that's being delivered, they may need special consideration in a contract. For example, clauses obliging a supplier to partake in the customer's own disaster recovery tests and work with the customer to ensure that they all run and operate smoothly. In an IT context, particularly with cloud services, disaster recovery is often a part of the service offering that a customer will be buying and can have a significant impact on charges. Clearly, having a hot standby that is in a production environment and running in the same time as the live system has a much bigger cost impact than a cold standby where there's merely capacity available if it's called for in the future. Those points are often well rehearsed and understood by IT teams when they run their questionnaires with suppliers pre-contract and may actually have formed a significant part of the reason for selecting a particular supplier. It's not always the case, though, that those requirements make it through into the final contract, which is certainly something we would recommend so that there are contractual obligations around those important representations that suppliers made pre-contract, including going as far as having service levels for recovery time objectives, so how long it takes systems to come back to life after a disaster, and the recovery point objective, at what point data in systems will be backed up to ensure that the customer knows how its systems will respond and what it can expect in a disaster, and then plan accordingly. Data backups are clearly part of that planning. Cloud services will ensure live software and may recover their software, but considering what happens to the data within that software is a separate discussion and more of a customer concern and a customer point to drive within those contracts. So if you have been running your disaster recovery plans with your supplier, you clearly have good lines of communication open with them, which will be an important part of responding to any disaster. And that should be built into a robust governance structure within the contract that makes these clauses come to life and encourages collaboration and cooperation. The last thing you want when something unexpected happens is to reach for the contract in the hope that a notices clause tells you who you might need to talk to in the supplier. What you should be aiming for in those situations is really to have operationalized the contract, to have brought it to life in practical to-do lists or manuals, so that teams know in the event of a disaster, a practical checklist that they can turn to rather than looking to a clause in the contract that might need lawyers to help interpret it, and realizing that the paperwork that they need doesn't actually exist at that point in time. One way we can help with that in a legal sense is by creating templates that sit alongside the contract. So some of the options that Matt talked about earlier, where a customer might want to decrease scope or remove elements of services from scope, can be quickly and easily called off, rather than business first having to get hold of a legal contact to prepare those notices for them. Smart contracts is another way that you might be able to help mitigate effects of people or systems not being available. This will obviously depend hugely on context and what your contract is, but if you of technology using sensors or blockchain to interpret real life events and then automatically make payments, send off notifications, that would help mitigate the effect of particular people not being around to make those payments or check those points in your contract delivery and service performance. It alleviates some of the reliance on the human input. Altogether, communicating with your supplier here is one of the key points to ensure you have a plan together and understand how you work together in a disaster scenario so you are able to give that quick response. Ultimately, though, whatever the turn of events has been, might mean that your supplier is just not able to cope or not able to give you what you need in the timescale that you need it, and you find you have a right to terminate. Matt's going to look at what an orderly termination looks like.
Exiting IT agreements can be a complicated and risky process. You might be having to bring services back in-house, or dealing with a supplier that is no longer has your custom and asking them to work with you to bring those services back in-house or move them to another third party. It's a cliche, but in the run-up to exit, there is often too much to do and too little time to do it. So how do you avoid this time pressure? Well, the best way to deal with an exit is to plan. I think we can all agree that a well-planned exit is likely to be smoother. When the pressure is on, people need to know what to do and when they have to do it. Yet typically the exit schedule is hidden away at the back of the contract and includes an obligation for the supplier to provide an exit plan. Some may say an afterthought. However, the best time to plan an exit is at the outset of the agreement, and it's important that you make sure that your supplier prepares the exit plan and that you validate this exit plan at the outset of the contract. But that's not to say the planning should stop there. As the contract evolves, so should the exit plan. There should be a requirement in a contract for the supplier to update the plan at periodic intervals during the life of the contract. All too often this is overlooked, so it's important that you make sure that your suppliers are constantly updating the plan. You don't want to get to the point of exit and find the plan that does not refer or resemble the system that is in place. And ultimately, in order to deploy the plan, the customer and supply teams need to understand their obligations prior to the point of exit. And this follows the theme of the slide so far. Plan in advance and prepare your exit process. Brief the teams and you can react more quickly. But when it comes to exit, there are going to be other considerations. And we've put two examples on the slide. For example, data. When exiting an agreement, there's likely going to be a migration or extraction of data. Your team needs to be aware of what data is held by the third party or is being used by the third party, so that that data can be moved effectively or deleted. And if 2P applies, planning is going to be essential to ensure that you comply with timetables stipulated by law. Now, we've talked a lot about the actual exit from the current supplier, But if you're transitioning to a new supplier, you're going to need resource in order to do that. So you may be running an exit, but also an onboarding process at the same time. And it's important that you've thought through the resource that you're going to need to ensure that the transition is smooth and that your relationship with the new supplier is productive from the outset. And if you are transitioning to a new supplier, it's likely that you've left your old supplier for a reason. Learning from past lessons can be the best way to move forward. And it may be that some of those past issues can be actively built into and managed through the contract with your new supplier. Now, obviously, there's going to be an interaction between your outgoing supplier and your new supplier. You're probably going to need your outgoing supplier to share information, which can be a sensitive subject because the outgoing supplier will be nervous around the sharing of information regarding their service, and they'll be keen to protect their confidential information and IP. To the greatest extent possible, it's important that the exit provisions in the contract clearly set out those obligations with regard to sharing. It's certainly an area which could give rise to friction and dispute. And also, it's an area which should be addressed through the exit plan to make sure that the parties both understand what information is available and how it can be shared. To sum up this slide and our thoughts on this issue, the best way to exit an agreement is to plan and keep planning. Planning should start when the contract is negotiated and continue until the exit plan is deployed.
We hope that's given you some useful food for thought around issues to consider differently when you're entering into new contracts in the future in the light of what we've seen following COVID and lockdown and the effect it's had on suppliers, services and goods. If you've got any questions following this webinar, my details and Matt's are on the slide in front of you now, so please don't hesitate, drop us a line and get in touch. Thank you very much.